So this is the medieval roots of Warhammer 40,000's Endless Crusade. This is presented by Rory MacLellan, who holds a PhD in medieval history from the University of St Andrews, specialising in the Crusades and their modern legacies. He's published several articles, a monograph, and an edited collection on these topics, and he's currently a cataloguer and manuscript researcher at the British Library. Very exciting to have you here. And as you'll see in my talk with John Blanche later, the medieval roots of 40k are, I think, very self-evident, but it's also something that John Blanche himself is very aware of, as you will find when you see my pre-recorded video with him later. So absolutely delighted to have you here, really keen to listen to this. So without further ado, over to you.
Is it best for people online if I actually sit in the chair? So you can
like.
We'll make it easier to adjust PowerPoint. So, a civilization that believes itself to be surrounded by enemies on all sides, responding by repeatedly sending out crusades in all directions, and even directing these within itself against those that its religious leaders have deemed to be heretics. And such is the strength of this movement that whole aspects of society are turned over to crusading, with some military forces dedicating themselves to a permanent, endless crusade. And this could be a description of the Imperium of Warhammer 40,000, but it can also describe the crusade movement of medieval Europe. And so this paper will look at the historical roots of 40k's endless crusades, how they reflect the pluralist definition of crusading, and how the further shaping these fictional wars reflects that of the real world crusade movement. And so I'll begin by just giving a brief overview of what crusades actually are in 40k before examining how they compare to medieval reality. So the Imperium is constantly at war, waging an endless series of military campaigns, the largest of which are known as crusades. The High Lords of Terror and the Lord Commander Robert Guilliman are the only figures with the necessary authority to declare a new crusade. And from the Great Crusade 10,000 years earlier to the Indomitus Crusade of the setting's present day, these campaigns can be directed against any and all foes across the galaxy, and they are massive in scale and last for decades or more. Both of those particular conflicts saw battles against Xenos, forces of chaos, and other humans, whilst smaller crusades may be directed against just one of these opponents, such as the Sabbath World Crusades in Dan Abnett's Gaunt's Ghosts novels. Now, some groups within the Imperium take crusading even further, like the Black Templars chapter of Space Marines, who have been fighting an endless crusade since their foundation, soon after the Horus Heresy, beginning what has been called in one of the Black Templars codices, the longest crusade in the history of the Imperium. Every campaign waged by the chapter is called a crusade. They maintain no home world, instead they're constantly on the move, battling across the galaxy. Other Space Marine chapters may be sent on penitent crusades as punishment for some slight. 30 chapters were sentenced to such crusade in 321 M37 after they were deemed to be lacking in faith. Even small squads or individuals can be sent on penitent crusades. This is just one of the possible endings in the video game Dawn of War 2 Chaos Rising. If the player's forces have moderate to low levels of chaos corruption, then the game ends with them being sentenced to go to the Eye of Terror and fight a century-long crusade there to redeem themselves. Nor is this small-scale crusading limited to just the superhuman Space Marines. Unmodified humans known as Crusaders are warrior monks who leave their monastery to fulfill some sacred vow that they've sworn. And fans of the game and its world could think that this depiction of crusading is unique to 40k, that its endless holy wars are just another invention of the game's grim, dark future, an exaggeration, a caricature of history. And while this does describe the centuries-long Great Crusade and the sheer scale of the wars, the Imperium's wide-ranging and constant crusading does actually have a historical basis in the medieval crusade movement. Now, popular views of the Crusades still interpret these wars as being primarily aimed at the Holy Land. They take in the 9 numbered crusades from the First Crusade in 1096, which ended in 1099 with the capture of Jerusalem and the establishment of 4 Crusader states in Palestine and Syria, through to the 9th Crusade in 1271-72, and end in 1291, when Acre, the last Crusader stronghold on the mainland, fell to the Mamluk Sultans. And this definition of crusading can easily found even in recent books, documentaries, and very widespread online. The book on the right there, I think, is only published last year. So it is really, that's still the traditional view that many people outside academia have of the Crusades. But Crusade scholars have long since expanded the scope of the Crusade movement, both geographically and chronologically. So the historian Giles Constable proposed that there were 4 main ways of defining what were the Crusades. And these were the traditionalists, the pluralists, generalists, and popularists. And the traditionalist definition of crusading is very much this only the Holy Land, 1096, 1291 sort of view. And only the ones that are sent to either defend or recover Jerusalem really count as real crusades. The pluralist view is much more expansive, and it holds that whatever expedition was carried out with special religious privileges from the Pope, so a crusade bull that grants a full remission of sins for anyone who undertakes the crusade, and has participants swearing a crusade penitential vow, is a crusade. Generalists hold the crusading as just part of a much wider tradition of Christian warfare, and they reject actually defining crusade as a distinct separate entity. And then finally, popularists emphasize crusading really as being mass popular movements fueled by prophetic and apocalyptic beliefs, so particularly things like the First Crusade. Now, as with any strict division, choosing just one of these, there's always a drawback to each of them. There are nuances and intricacies that are smoothed out by these 4 schools. And so most Crusade historians see strengths and weaknesses in each. And today, the mainstream position is largely pluralist, so takes in the broad chronology and the geography of that definition, but also acknowledges that the traditionalist emphasis on the special status of Jerusalem and the Holy Land, the popularist highlighting of millenarianism and the participation of masses, and the generalist stance of seeing crusading within a wider context of Christian holy war and ecclesiastical violence. So under this pluralist definition, crusading expands from a small number of campaigns in the Middle East, mostly in the area on this map, to take in all of this. So it now takes in North Africa, Northern Europe, Spain, France, Eastern Europe. The so-called Reconquista in Spain and Portugal, which saw Christian states conquer the Muslim rulers of southern Spain, were treated as crusades. They were backed by crusade bulls, and some popes even banned Spanish knights from going to Jerusalem, saying that they needed to stay at home and fight there. In Northern Europe, the pagan peoples of the Baltic were targeted by crusades from the late 1140s. Over 3 centuries, the pagan Prussians, Livonians, Estonians, and Lithuanians would be Christianized at the point of the sword by men receiving crusade indulgences. Even stretching into North Africa, the conquest of the Canary Islands, begun by 2 Norman knights in 1402, was backed by a crusade bull, and the chronicle of their campaign presents the war as a crusade. Portugal's conquest of Ceuta in Morocco in 1415 was also treated as a crusade. And it was not only non-Christians who were the targets. The Cathars of southern France in the 12th and 13th century, and the Hussites of Bohemia in the 15th, were both Christian groups which had been deemed heretical by the papacy, launching several crusade expeditions against them. Before the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople in 1204, then ruled by Orthodox Greek Christians, so still Christians, different denomination, Some of the Crusaders argued that they were a legitimate target because they rejected the Pope. In the 1290s, when the Pope struggled against his political enemies in Rome, the Colonna family, he called a crusade against them. In 1421, the English Parliament asked Henry V to petition the Pope for a crusade against the Irish because of their resistance to English rule. So it even becomes really a political weapon. The shift from the medieval period to the early modern period around the start of the 16th century then sees crusading continue in the Mediterranean and expand well beyond, carried out by European colonization in all directions. Portugal's invasion of Morocco in 1578 was backed by crusade bulls, as was the Spanish Armada sent against Protestant England in 1588. Crusade leagues battled the Ottoman Empire for control of the Mediterranean as late as 1697, so alliances that were organised and centred on the papacy and directed just against the Muslim Ottoman Empire. Christopher Columbus's diaries reveal that he hoped that a western route to India and the wealth it would bring would actually lead to the recapture of Jerusalem. In 1514, Christian II of Denmark and Norway received a crusade bull from the Pope to undertake an expedition to India going via the Arctic Ocean. And there was later a joint Danish-Portuguese plan to go retake Greenland, use that as a stepping stone to go all the way around the world. And then you would come up on Jerusalem from behind. And in Africa, the Kingdom of Congo, converted to Christianity by the Portuguese, even took on the trappings of crusaders. So they had a flag that they bore in battle that had a cross on it and had been blessed by the Pope. In 1509, King Afonso I of Congo claimed that a cross and St. James appeared in the sky before he battled against his pagan brother for the throne, an incident that wouldn't be out of place in any of sort of earlier crusade chronicles. Now, James has long been considered a crusading saint, eventually becoming known in Spain as Santiago Matamoros, so the Moor Slayer. And as Spain began its conquest of the Americas, a new variant emerged. So you can see Matamoros on the left, and you can see that clearly these are caricatures of Muslims that he is running down. But in the Americas, he then becomes Santiago Mata-Indios, so the Indian Slayer. And again, you can see that basically the only thing that has changed is the people he's attacking. Later on, when you start to get all of the colonial movements, they then end up creating Santiago Mata Hispanos, so Santiago the Spaniard Slayer. And again, it's the same pose, but he's now running down caricatures of Spanish people. And so though these campaigns were not backed by papal bulls, the rhetoric and the imagery of crusading continued. And Spain's new colonies in the Americas would actually pay crusade taxes to support campaigns back in Europe. And the Imperium's crusading in all directions against heretics and xenos, or directed inward to settle political scores, is little different from this deployment by medieval and early modern Europe of crusades against targets far beyond the Near East. So the second edition Codex Ultramarines is one of the few sources to actually offer a direct definition of a crusade in 40k. And it sounds very much like this pluralist definition, that only the High Lords of Terror can declare a crusade, and it's likely to be against heretic lords, rebellious planetary governments, could also be against alien worlds or newly discovered planets. A more recent publication, the rulebook for the tabletop role-playing spin-off game Only War, offers a similar definition. It's declared by the High Lords, directed against newly discovered area or one that has been lost to either Xenos or Chaos. So like medieval Europe, the launching of an imperial crusade is authorized by a supreme authority, one with a religious component, as one of the High Lords is the ecclesiarch, the head of the Imperium state church. And these campaigns can be directed against any and all opponents and even into newly discovered territories. And crusading is pervasive throughout imperial society. It is the default method of waging large campaigns, while individuals may undertake a crusade vow or have one forced upon them as punishment. The preaching and massive taxation used to recruit and fund crusades would mean that even non-combatants would be aware of it and would encounter this. And crusading was similarly entrenched in medieval society. It became a core part of ideas of chivalry and kingship, with going on crusade the sign of a good knight or ruler. In the Baltic, knights from all over Europe would join the Teutonic Knights on their summer rising, which was a sort of very dark medieval package holiday, where you'd go and you'd be hosted and there'd be tournaments and feasts and prizes and you'd meet with all of the other great knights of Europe, but then you'd go on a crusade and rampage and raid around Lithuanian territory. And church taxes were raised all across Europe and even beyond, specifically for crusading. There would be collection chests just for the crusade placed in parish churches, supported by public preaching in the churches and in public spaces. Beginning with the Second Council of Leon in 1274, crusade taxes were even raised as far away as the Norse colonies on Greenland. In 1327, they paid this in the form of walrus teeth. And even in death, crusading continued, with people leaving bequests in their wills towards the Holy Land. In her will of 1355, Elizabeth de Burgh, Countess of Ulster, left 100 marks for 5 armed men to go to the east in God's service and the destruction of his enemies. Lands that were not even on a crusade frontier felt the need to invent or exaggerate the existence of non-Christian neighbours so that they didn't feel left out. So there's several Danish and Norwegian sources in the 15th and 16th centuries that claim that they have their own frontier zone of non-Christians that rivals that lies across the Mediterranean. So right along the top line here, and from the left, it says that they've got infidel Karelians up here in the Arctic Circle. Then they've got unipeds, which are these imaginary creatures where they've just got one leg, and they're also giant. And then they've got pygmies as well. And then I think Scythians at the far right. And just for context, the island very off to the left here, that's sort of a crescent, is Iceland. And then to the bottom left of it, Ireland. The weird sticky out bit, that's Scotland. Then you've got Orkney. And then at the centre of the map, that is Norway. And then you've got Denmark and then Sweden. So Karelians do exist, but they're not over there. And so there's this idea also that they're linked up, they're on the same land as Greenland somehow. So that they create this sort of fantasy of we can be part of it too, because we're also surrounded by non-Christians. Now, the Imperium's penitent crusades have a real-world equivalent as well, and crusading at its core is penitential. From the First Crusade onwards, participants were promised a remission of sins, and crusade sermons would emphasize the hardship that crusaders would face on their long journey. Penitential pilgrimages had existed long before as a punishment for criminals. And so the armed pilgrimage of crusade was used in the same way, often for crimes against the church. And perhaps the most famous example, which you can see on this seal of the city of Canterbury, are the 4 murderers of St. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1170, who you can see murdered him in his church. And they then get sentenced by the Pope to a lifelong crusade, all of which they conveniently die on. Warhammer 40,000's professional lifelong crusaders, Black Templars, also have medieval counterparts, most obviously the military religious orders that they are named for. Arising in the early 12th century, the military orders combined the life of a monk with that of a knight, and the most famous of these were the Knights Templar, which you can see on the far left, who give the Black Templars their name, though the chapter's cross and black and white colour scheme are taken from another order, the Knights Hospitaller, you can see in the middle, while their Germanic names are a reference to yet another order, the Teutonic Knights, which you can see on the far right. And these 3 medieval orders did carry out something like the Eternal Crusade of the Black Templars. They continued to fight on the frontiers of Europe long after the major crusade expeditions had returned home or ceased altogether. And their military role did not end with the loss of Acre in 1291. The Hospitallers moved first to Cyprus, then Rhodes, and then Malta, where they remained until its conquest by Napoleon in 1798. All the while, they fought a naval war against the Ottoman Empire for another 5 centuries after the loss of the Holy Land. The Teutonic Knights established themselves in the Baltic in the early 13th century and ruled their own state there for over 300 years, during which they warred against pagan Lithuania. And even after the Reformation saw them expelled from the Baltic, the Teutonic Order sort of got a bit absorbed by the Austro-Hungarian army, but they continued to have a regiment in that army all the way up to 1918, where all the officers were knights, all the senior officers at least, were knights of Teutonic Order. And these were just the 3 largest military orders, but the others proliferated across Europe, particularly in Spain and Portugal. Proposals for new military orders were made even in the 16th and 17th century. And the last one is founded in 1891, but only exists for a year. But there is a very mad photo of a bunch of people in Africa in pith helmets with modern rifles with a big Crusader cross on their chest. It's really strange. So like the Imperium, this is a society that's permeated with the idea of holy war, and it really sticks around for a very long time. So in terms of their scope, by targeting any and all enemies across the galaxy and pervasiveness, whether it be crusading as an act of penitence or the existence of permanent crusaders like the Black Templars, imperial crusading shares much in common with that of the medieval and early modern world. And while it may have been intended as a caricature of medieval fanaticism, it is actually surprisingly close to a real past.